Today's lesson is Tonga eruption shook much of the Pacific. Hi, everybody. My name is Roger.
And I'm Mike.
And today we're going to go to the South Pacific Ocean and the island of Tonga. Maybe you heard the news. Back in January, there was a volcanic eruption that was photographed by a satellite. It was huge. It was powerful. And, of course, people here in Taiwan were concerned because it may have caused a tsunami. And fortunately, did not, or at least it did not create a very big one. But still, Tonga suffered because of this eruption.
That's right. Most of the area around the Pacific Ocean luckily was saved from these huge waves, these tsunamis. But for the island of Tonga, the island group that makes up the country we call Tonga, they were very close to the volcano. So, of course, they did suffer some damage. We're going to learn all about it as we read the first part of our article. Tonga eruption shook much of the Pacific. The underwater volcano that erupted near Tonga in January released more energy than an atomic bomb, said scientists at NASA. The eruption shook much of the Pacific, sending tsunamis as far as the west coast of the U.S. The blast could be heard from Alaska.
大家好，第一部分我们看到动词 erupt 表示火山爆发或是喷发或是冲突突然发生。例如 Steam erupted from the broken pipe 蒸汽从破裂的管线中喷出。或是 A fight erupted between rival fans at the soccer match 那场足球赛上对立的球迷之间爆发冲突。另外将这个字的字尾加上 ion 就变成了名词 eruption 意思是爆发或是喷出。像是 People left the town out of fear that an eruption was coming from the nearby volcano. 人们害怕附近的火山爆发而离开城镇。接着我们看到单字 blast 这个字是名词，指爆炸或是发出的巨大声响。例如 Several people were injured in the blast, which was caused by a gas explosion. 好几人在这场爆炸中受伤，起因是瓦斯爆炸。或是I could hear the blast from the bomb even though I was many miles away. 即使我在离炸弹几英里外的地方，我还能听得到爆炸声。另外，这个字还可以当作动词，表示抨击或是严厉批评。我们可以说 Fans blasted the referee after he made a wrong call in the game. 裁判在比赛中做出一次错误判决后，球迷大力抨击。或者Critics blasted the film's violence. 评论家谴责那部电影的暴力情节。再补充一个含有 blast 在内的片语 blast off, off, O-F-F, blast off, 意思是发射或是升空。这里 blast 是动词，表示爆炸或是飞速前进的意思。像是 Hundreds of people showed up to watch the rocket blast off into space.数百人前来观看火箭发射飞向太空。也可以说 Johnny's dream was to become an astronaut and blast off into space. Johnny 的梦想是成为太空人，升空飞向太空。
Okay, let's talk about the first part of our article right now. Of course, when a volcano blows up, we say it erupts. So in the title here, we have the noun form of the verb to erupt, and that is eruption. So the eruption near Tonga there shook not only the island of Tonga or the islands around there, but also much of the Pacific Ocean. So here the first paragraph begins by saying, the underwater volcano that erupted near Tonga in January released more energy than an atomic bomb, said scientists at NASA. So, of course, this volcano was not above ground like, say, Mount Fuji or Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. This one was actually underwater. It was beneath the water. It's a volcano underwater. There are a lot of them in the world. And it erupted near Tonga last January. And when you have a volcanic eruption, it can release a lot of energy. In this case, NASA said it released more energy than an atomic bomb.
Bigger than the ones they dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. So this gives you an idea. We're using this not to sort of say it was used as a weapon, but we're giving it a comparison like this to explain or kind of give a demonstration of the power, the energy that was released by this underwater volcano when it erupted. The power was so great, it says the eruption shook much of the Pacific, sending tsunamis as far as the west coast of the U.S. So this is quite amazing when you think about the huge area of land we're talking about here. From Tonga to the west coast of the U.S., think of California, Oregon, places like that, thousands and thousands of kilometers away. But it was enough to send these waves, these tsunamis, all the way across, basically, the Pacific Ocean. Luckily, the tsunamis that hit California weren't too big, too powerful, but the energy released was quite astonishing. Here's another amazing fact. The blast could be heard from Alaska. An explosion, a blast, we use both of these to talk about a huge and very violent and very quick release of energy. So a blast or an explosion, these are kind of the same things. When you think of how loud an explosion can be, well, sure, lots of things can be loud when they explode, but are they loud enough to be heard basically on the other side of the world from Tonga to Alaska? That's even more thousands of kilometers away. Quite incredible.
Yep, blast here again is a noun, but it could also be a verb. And also as a noun, the word blast can be a slang term for a good time. So I could ask my friend Jeff, hey, I heard you went skiing in Korea. How was it? And he replied, oh, it was a blast. We had a great time. Okay, that brings us to the end of the first part of our lesson for today. Let's move on now to the second part. We will listen first.
Satellites captured images of huge ash clouds shooting 40 kilometers high and a shockwave traveling at nearly the speed of sound. NASA said the blast had hundreds of times the power of the atomic explosion at Hiroshima. It was the largest eruption recorded on the planet in more than 30 years. The nearby islands of Tonga were hit hard by tsunamis and blanketed with ash. Video footage of the disaster showed people running to higher ground and waves flooding parts of the Tongan capital, Nuku'alofa. Almost all of the country's 100,000 residents were affected. The Polynesian nation consists of about 170 islands, 36 of which are inhabited.
第二部分我们看到名词 disaster 指灾难或是不幸。举例来说 The show last night was a disaster. The new guitar player messed up on half the songs. 昨晚的演出是一场灾难，新来的吉他手搞砸了一半的歌曲。或是 People in the city tried to help each other after the disaster. 这座城市的人在那场灾难之后努力互相帮忙。另外补充 disaster 的形容词 disastrous, D-I-S-A-S-T-R-O-U-S, disastrous, 指灾难的或是损失惨重的。例如 A lack of proper emergency preparedness can have disastrous consequences. 缺乏紧急应变能力可能会带来惨重的后果。或是 Violet had a disastrous time on vacation as she got a bad case of food poisoning. Violet 度假时过得很惨，因为她严重食物中毒。
Okay, now remember, everybody, when this news came out, a lot of us saw pictures of this eruption from space. And the only way to get pictures of the Earth from space is by satellite. So satellites captured images of huge ash clouds shooting 40 kilometers high and a shockwave traveling at nearly the speed of sound. Okay, so again, a satellite, of course, is a machine that is in outer space circling the Earth, and it's oftentimes used for communication purposes. We could also describe a moon around a planet as being a natural satellite, like the moon is the natural satellite of the Earth. But here, most of the time, when you see the word satellite, it is referring to that machine that is circling the Earth.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, what they were taking a picture of wasn't too hard to see. We're talking about ash clouds or clouds of burnt rock material shooting 40 kilometers high. 40 kilometers is extremely high. We're talking about basically the edge of space. So that's how much sort of smoke or debris came out of this underwater volcano. And then the shock wave, this is the energy released. You can actually sometimes even see it traveling across the Earth. We can imagine a lot of Hollywood disaster movies when there's a big explosion or an asteroid hitting the Earth. There's a shock wave, this sort of circle of energy that expands and grows and rushes away from where the explosion happened. And it's traveling extremely quickly. The speed of sound, that's around 1,200 kilometers per hour. So we're talking about extremely fast, extremely powerful, and extremely dangerous.
Indeed, and NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration of the United States, NASA said the blast had hundreds of times the power of the atomic explosion at Hiroshima.
Wow.
That's Guangdao, of course, in Chinese. Hiroshima is the Japanese name, and that, of course, was the first bomb dropped on Japan during World War II in August of 1945. The Hiroshima bomb killed lots and lots of people, so it was quite a big bomb. But in this case, the volcanic eruption, the blast, had hundreds of times the power of the atom bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. So that's pretty darn powerful.
Absolutely, and also very rare, as we learn. It was the largest eruption recorded on the planet in more than 30 years. That actually might be going back to that Mount Pinatubo eruption in the Philippines. I think that was back in the 90s at some point. But of course, this kind of thing doesn't happen very often. Well, volcanic eruptions probably happen every day, but most of them are fairly small. They don't make the news, and they certainly aren't as powerful as this one, the biggest one that scientists have recorded in 30 years. So, big news, of course, a little bit worrying if you're far away in California or Taiwan or Alaska, but for the people close by, this was a serious, serious problem and a big danger. The nearby islands of Tonga were hit hard by tsunamis and blanketed with ash. By the time those tsunamis reached California, they might have lost some energy, but nearby islands, the islands close to the eruption like Tonga, they were hit hard. They had a big and devastating impact, those tsunamis. And of course, those 40-kilometer high clouds of ash, well, that ash comes down. And when things come down and cover an area of land, usually a large area, we often use this term to blanket with. Some area in the winter might be blanketed with snow or something like that, as if nature has thrown a blanket over the land. Everything you see when you look out your window is covered by snow, buildings, roads, trees, fields. In this case, it's covered with ash, and of course, that is very dangerous for people.
It does rain a lot here in Taiwan, but you cannot say Taipei was blanketed with rain. You can say blanketed with snow, like for Tokyo or places like that. And in this particular case, we've got volcanic ash, like ashes from a cigarette or from a campfire. It's kind of similar there. It's kind of gray and powdery. So, of course, the area was blanketed with ash, and that can cause problems if it gets on your car, and it can cause problems with the engine and stuff like that. And then the next sentence here says, video footage of the disaster showed people running to higher ground and waves flooding parts of the Tongan capital, Nuku'alofa. And, of course, when you shoot video, what you see when you press the play button is video footage, okay? The scenes of video from this area showed this disaster, and it also showed people running to higher ground. A disaster, of course, is something terrible that happens. A typhoon is a natural disaster. A tornado is a natural disaster. And I guess a volcanic eruption is also a natural disaster. And people, of course, were running to higher ground because the waves were coming, and then the waves flooded parts of the capital city there. It flooded into the streets and damaged cars and took out some plants and things like that.
Absolutely. And since the islands of Tonga aren't that big, it affected everyone. Obviously, a volcano of this power, this close to a small country, will definitely affect everybody there. Almost all of the country's 100,000 residents were affected. And this is a huge area. We think of Tonga as a small country, but if you actually look at it on the map, it does cover quite a large area, and we learn why, because the Polynesian nation, we're talking about Tonga, and it's in an area of the world that we call Polynesia. It consists of about 170 islands, 36 of which are inhabited. So many of these islands are quite small. People can't really live on them or choose not to live on them, but 36 of these islands, spread out over many hundreds of square kilometers, are inhabited. That means people live on them. So, of course, for all those people, communication suddenly became hard. Their lives were possibly even at risk in certain places, and they were dealing with the fear of tsunamis, the damage caused by those tsunamis, and, of course, the ash as it came down.
Okay, that brings us to the end of the second part of our lesson for today. Let's move on now and talk about the third part.
Australia, New Zealand, and other countries quickly sent aid, including food, water, and medical supplies. But the process of delivering aid was made more difficult by Tonga's COVID-19 restrictions. The island nation was one of the few countries in the world to remain almost completely virus-free.
Okay, so we've got Australia, New Zealand, and other countries. They quickly sent aid or assistance, including food, water, and medical supplies. So these countries are nearby. They're not too far away from Tonga, and they decided to help out. Hey, we've got money. We weren't hurt by this volcanic eruption, so we'll help you guys out there. So they sent aid. And that aid included food, water, and medical supplies in case people were injured. They sent plenty of gauze and bandages and medicine and other good stuff like that.
Now, having the Army and the Navy from Australia and New Zealand arrive with their big ships filled with aid, and of course, soldiers and doctors and other people there to help the people of Tonga was a great thing. And of course, that is always something we love to see in the news after we have these disasters. But as the article continues, the process of delivering aid was made more difficult by Tonga's COVID-19 restrictions. Ah, yes, having people visit from foreign countries, even if it's a natural disaster, even if they're bringing aid and all sorts of expert assistance, it's made difficult because we have these restrictions, these rules against people traveling and moving from country to country. As we learn in the final sentence of this section and of our article, the island nation was one of the few countries in the world to remain almost completely virus-free. When you're sitting in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and you're waiting for aid, well, that distance can be a problem. But when you're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and there's a pandemic flowing around the world, being that far away from everyone can actually be a great benefit. And so over the last 2 years, basically, Tonga has been almost completely virus-free. They kept COVID-19 out. I believe they only had a few cases, maybe 0 deaths. But when you had people visiting from Australia, which did have a lot of COVID-19 problems coming into the country, well, the doctors and leaders of Tonga were suddenly very worried. We love the aid, but we don't want you to bring in COVID-19 along with the aid because we've been virus-free or free of the virus since 2020 when this all started.
Yep, so during normal times, it would have been no problem. Go ahead, bring in that aid, bring in those medical supplies. But of course, we've got those COVID-19 restrictions going on all over the world. We want to keep that nasty disease at bay. So, of course, the ships were arriving and the people of Tonga were saying, no, we want the aid, we need the help, we need the assistance, but we just don't want that virus coming in here. So, of course, that was a big problem, which we will talk about in our next lesson. But right now, we're going to say farewell after we hear from our Chinese teacher, Hanny.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny， 我们来看今天的文法重点。今年1月，东加附近的海底火山爆发。那标题里面用到名词 eruption 来表达爆发，我们文中也有用到它的动词是 erupt。那我们来学习它的字首字根。好，当你看到 rupt 这个字根呢，就表示破裂啊、断裂或是打破。有这个字根的字大多带有突然被介入或者是打破原本规律的那种含义。那么在 erupt 这个字当中，它的字首 e表示向外， rupt 表示破裂。当爆炸的时候啊，就会有东西破裂，会很多碎屑向外喷发，所以应该很容易联想到 erupt 它有喷发爆发的意思。那我们顺便补充2个有相同字根的单字。第一个是介绍 corrupt C-O-R-R-U-P-T， 那它的字首 C-O-R 是来自 C-O-M， 只是因为 C-O-M 碰到字母 R 被同化成 C-O-R。 好，那这个字首呢，它有强调的作用。那么字根 R-U-P-T 则是表示破裂。当所有的事物全都崩坏、分离、破裂，我们也许可以联想到 corrupt 它有那种败坏啊、腐化的意思。好，那么 corrupt 当形容词就可以描述贪污的、腐败的或是道德败坏的，当动词则表示使什么堕落、腐化或腐败。好，下一个介绍的是 abrupt A-B-R-U-P-T， 那它的字首 A-B 有分离的意思， R-U-P-T 表示打断。当某个东西突然断裂分离，是不是会让人有那种很突然很意外的感受呢？也许可以用这样的画面去联想到 abrupt 它有那种意外的、突然的、唐突的那种意思。那课文第2部分的第2句写到，美国航太总署表示，这次爆炸的威力是广岛原子弹爆炸的数百倍。好，那这边我们来复习倍数的表示法。在用倍数进行比较的时候，一般我们就是用数字加上 times 来表达几倍，像 3 times 3倍， 4 times 4倍等等。那么一半我们用 half， 那么2倍你可以用 2 times 或者是 twice。 好，来看看常见的倍数说法有以下3种。第一种呢，就是用倍数加上比较级加上 than 点点点。好，举例来说， The city's population is 4 times larger than Taipei's， 那个城市的人口数是台北的4倍。好，那要特别注意 half 跟 twice 不能用这个比较级这个句型来做比较，我们要表达2倍则必须用 2 times 加上比较级再加上 than 点点点。好，再来看第2个说法，你可以用倍数加上as 形容词 as。 好，举例来说， The dog is 3 times as heavy as our cat， 那只狗的重量，这个体重呢是我们猫咪的3倍。那第3个说法，你是用倍数加上 the 加上名词计量词加 of 点点点。英文里面我们常见的名词计量词就包括 size、 length、 age、 number、 weight、 height 等等。举例来说， Their new apartment is twice the size of their old one， 他们的新公寓是旧公寓的2倍大。那这个用法呢，有时候我们也会看到另一种句型，就是倍数加上 once， 也就是所有格的部分，再加名词计量词。例如 His son is about half his height， 他儿子的身高大约是他的1半。好，以上是今天重点整理，我们回顾今天的单字吧。
Underwater. During the diving trip, the group explored a number of underwater caves. Erupt. The volcano erupted, sending rocks and ash high into the sky. Blast. The blast was so powerful that we felt it on the other side of the city. Satellite. Currently, there are more than 6,500 satellites orbiting the Earth. Disaster. The country was in desperate need of aid after the natural disaster. Inhabit. When we passed through the town, we were surprised to discover that it was still inhabited.
Discussion starter starts now!
Okay, now it's time for our discussion starter, and the question is, do you think Tonga should have relaxed its COVID-19 restrictions to make delivering aid easier? Why or why not?
That's a very tough question. Well, I would have to say that I think Tonga should have relaxed its restrictions a little bit, since I guess the problem of having people without food and water is a much bigger problem than dealing with COVID-19, right? With COVID-19, we do have medicines, we do have vaccines. It would, of course, be bad if people in Tonga started to get it, but it would be worse if people in Tonga were living without electricity, without homes, without food, without water. That could potentially kill a lot more people than COVID-19 could, but a very tough decision. I am not jealous of the leader of Tonga and having to make these tough decisions at that time.
It must have been a very difficult decision indeed, but I think Tonga did the right thing by keeping its restrictions in place. And I say this because they were doing a very good job of keeping that disease out. And if they let it in, the people there probably don't have herd immunity. And the second that virus comes in, it could wipe out their entire population. So I think, yes, indeed, they should have kept those restrictions in place. And maybe they could have sent the supplies in smaller boats with nobody on them, just kind of give them a push and hope the supplies kind of drift across from the boat over to the harbor or something like that. They could have done something, maybe using ropes or something, or maybe even being helped by friendly dolphins.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Mike.
I am Roger. See you next time.